The hot day scorched the asphalt, and Carla Henderson, dressed in nondescript clothes, walked along the streets of the city's southern district, merging with the crowd. On the surface, she might have seemed like an ordinary woman rushing about her business, but behind her calm appearance hid an experienced agent of the Internal Security Department. For several weeks, she had been working on a case that could change the careers of many high-ranking police officers. Today was especially important. She was supposed to meet with Officer Jack Ryan, a man with an ambiguous reputation who had long attracted the attention of the department. Carla chose a route that allowed her to remain inconspicuous while exploring every corner of the neighborhood. The area where she worked had long suffered from police abuse, and Ryan's name often came up in complaints from locals. His behavior had always been outside the law, especially toward black citizens, whom he considered second-class citizens. Carla knew he had no idea who she really was, and that gave her an advantage. When she reached the old, run-down building, Ryan was there, as if he had been waiting for her. He was leaning against the car, his eyes studying her with cold, disdainful eyes. His movements were confident, and his posture conveyed the power he was accustomed to abusing. This was the moment she had been preparing for weeks. She knew that today would change everything, not just for her, but for him as well. Ryan had been sure that here was another defenseless woman, ready to be treated as he pleased, but it had never occurred to him that this would be his last day in this role. Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. You are very important to us, and we are always happy to read your stories. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new exciting stories. Enjoy watching. Carla James walked slowly down the busy street, her expression calm as her emotions simmered inside. She was a seasoned Homeland Security agent, with years of undercover work investigating police corruption and abuse of power. Today, her mission was especially important. She was to monitor Sergeant Tom Reynolds, a police officer who had been accused of multiple violent attacks against black residents of the city. However, none of the charges had ever reached trial. For Carla, it was a matter of honor. She knew that if she didn't, no one would get justice. The traffic on the street was heavy, but she noticed the scrutiny she was receiving. Reynolds stood by his police SUV, leaning lazily on the hood. His gaze slid over Carla with undisguised arrogance, as if he considered her beneath him, and not just because of her appearance. To him, she was just another black woman, undeserving of respect. People like her were often his targets. As Carla approached, Reynolds stepped forward without warning, blocking her path. His expression was a mixture of contempt and mockery. He was used to people quickly obeying his commands in such situations, especially those he believed had no authority. Without asking questions, he ordered her to stop and press herself against the wall. Carla complied, though her inner strength remained unshaken. "You look a little suspicious," he growled, grinning ironically. "What? You don't know how to behave on the street?" He sounded as if he was already anticipating the humiliation he was about to inflict. He had always been confident of his impunity, but today he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Carla was not the helpless victim he had imagined. She was an inside agent whose job it was to expose people like him. Reynolds continued to look at Carla with disdain, and his gaze seemed to tear her apart. He didn't just look at her, he looked through her, as if her personality and dignity didn't exist at all. In his eyes, she was just an object to be manipulated and humiliated. Carla tried to remain calm, but her heart was pounding. She knew she had to tread carefully. Any display of aggression on her part could provoke more serious consequences. Reynolds was often rude and cruel, and there was nothing new in his actions. It was like an alter ego from whom no one could expect justice. Reynolds began asking questions, his tone becoming increasingly aggressive. He demanded that Carla provide identification and explain why she was supposedly wandering around his neighborhood. Carla calmly but firmly explained that she had no identification because she was not going to the police. At this point, Reynolds took a more direct approach. He began to search Carla, his hands moving roughly and impatiently over her clothing. Carla felt his fingers touch her skin, and it reminded her of many similar cases where her colleagues and acquaintances had suffered unfair treatment. It was not just physical contact, but an expression of power and contempt. As she watched him dominate her, Carla remembered the stories she'd heard from her friends and family. Racism and bias were part of the system, and her job was not only to hold Reynolds accountable, but to expose the root problems that allowed officers like him to operate with impunity. Fortunately, her patience and fortitude paid off. During the search, Reynolds discovered something that intrigued him: a bunch of documents and notes that, while unrelated to the case, gave clues to her true role. He didn't know that these documents were part of her assignment, and that they had been carefully forged to look inconspicuous. Reynolds returned her things to her and, seeing her calm face, felt that his unsuccessful attempt at humiliation was ineffective. But he did not know that this was only the beginning. Carla was hiding her inner plan and intentions. She was ready to see it through to the end, despite the fact that her own sense of justice and truth was being questioned. Every step she took was part of a strategy that was carefully planned to expose and dismantle the system of bias and racism that permeated policing. Carla knew her journey would be long and difficult, but her determination and professionalism were unwavering. Reynolds was just one of many, and her mission was just beginning. Reynolds, satisfied that he had managed to adjust his daily routine a little, turned to his car, leaving Carla standing there, shaking with indignation, but his actions were only fanning the flames that would eventually lead to disaster for him. Carla tried to maintain her calm on the outside, but her inner tension was mounting. She knew that what was happening now was part of a larger problem, and her job was not just to document the abuses, but to expose the root of the problem. Unfortunately, to do so, she had to endure the humiliation and aggression that many in the area were familiar with. As she passed, Carla noticed a group of teenagers watching from afar. They were victims of the same systemic racism she was. Their fear and confusion were understandable. For them, this was further confirmation of their helplessness in the face of an authority that was not only cruel but also merciless. Carla understood that every incident, every humiliation she had endured, was part of their shared experience. Reynolds wasn't going to stop there. His next game was to show off his power in front of the public. He looked at Carla with disdain, as if she were a toy to be manipulated. He began telling her how she should behave, and his words were full of racist and derogatory remarks. "You see," he continued, not mincing his words, "people like you should know their place on the street, where you mean nothing." Carla stood with her head down, trying not to show how deeply her words and actions hurt her. Inside, her anger grew. Her work was important not only to her, but to everyone who would be another victim of this outrage. Each humiliated person was another motivation for her to fight for justice. She knew that Reynolds, despite his contempt, was just part of a larger system, a system woven with racism and prejudice that would not allow them to stand aside. For her, fighting this evil became not only a job, but a personal quest. As the teenagers began to retreat and Reynolds continued his brutal show of force, Carla knew that her actions had to be not only strategic, but demonstrative. Every step, every word, every movement had to not only expose the crimes, but also show that they mattered, that behind every act of injustice there were real people who deserved protection and respect. Her mission was clear. She had to not only gather evidence, but also show that even in the darkest moments, there was hope for change. And though her face remained calm, her soul burned with a determination that could change the future. Reynolds and all those like him would soon learn that their abuses would not go unpunished. Reynolds, feeling that he had impunity, continued to demonstrate his power, oblivious to the growing uneasiness of those around him. He knew that there was nothing new in his actions, that he was simply following established practices that not only allowed him but encouraged his rudeness and aggression. For him, it was a familiar day, another episode in a long series of humiliations. Carla stood there, watching as Reynolds continued his actions. His uncompromising and aggressive manner was part of a pattern that had long covered up such behavior. Each time he cut her off, her inner sense of justice burned brighter. Several minutes passed before another policeman, a junior officer, joined the scene. He was one of those who followed their seniors and rarely expressed an opinion, but he noticed that the situation was getting out of hand and began to intervene carefully, trying to smooth things over. But Reynolds wasn't about to let it go. He began to loudly and persistently describe how black people like Carla were constantly disruptive and failed to behave properly. These words weren't just Reynolds' personal opinions, they were a reflection of the systemic racism that permeated his professional environment. Reynolds turned to the bystanders who were also watching and insisted that people like Carla should be subjected to strict controls. His statements sounded like the stereotypes and biases that society has learned to ignore. This was not just a personal act of aggression, it was a manifestation of a deep, structural injustice. One of the teenagers standing nearby couldn't stand it any longer and voiced his dissatisfaction. His words were full of anger and despair. "Why do you always treat us like this? It's not fair." Reynolds turned and looked at the teenager, his gaze full of contempt and malice. He accused him of disturbing the peace and, under the pretext of prevention, began to write a report. Carla, watching this scene, felt that her own problems were becoming only part of a much larger picture. Reynolds continued to humiliate her and others, demonstrating his hatred for any form of resistance or discontent. His aggression was not only personal, it was part of the system that allowed him to act this way. As much as Carla tried to keep her cool, she saw that her job required more. She had to not only gather evidence, but also try to change public perception, to demonstrate that there were real consequences for every act of humiliation. When Reynolds finally broke away from his work and returned to his car, he didn't notice how Carla and her actions had become a symbol for many. People around her began to share thoughts and experiences, discussing what they had seen and realizing the scale of the problem. She knew that her task would not end there. Every humiliation, every slight, was part of her mission. She had to ensure that racism and abuse did not go unanswered. Her internal agenda was more than just collecting evidence. She needed to engage the public and bring about change within the system itself. Carla knew her path was difficult and dangerous, but her resolve was unwavering. She was ready to go all the way to expose and change the system that allowed this behavior to continue. This was not only her personal fight, but a fight for everyone who has ever suffered injustice. Carla stood in the crowd, her emotions on the verge of explosion. Although her exterior remained calm, her inner tension was boiling. Reynolds, feeling victorious, continued to demonstrate his dominance, but he had no idea that his actions could turn against him. As he passed Carla, Reynolds noticed that her clothes were slightly wrinkled from his rough handling. This only increased his desire to humiliate her. He turned back to Carla, his eyes blazing with anger, ready to move on to the next stage of his power play. Taking her by the shoulder, Reynolds roughly pushed her to the edge of the sidewalk. His actions were as brutal as they were sophisticated. He began shouting orders and instructions, increasingly derogatory and offensive with each passing minute. His words, full of prejudice and hatred, were directed not only at Carla, but at everyone around her. He began telling passers-by how she allegedly posed a threat to public order, how her actions constantly endangered safety, and how she needed to be kept under control. Reynolds didn't stop with words. He began to look Carla over cruelly, making her feel like a criminal. He tore her bag off and began to empty its contents onto the ground. Under the pretext of checking her, the attention of passers-by was drawn not only to the scene of humiliation, but also to the fact that Reynolds did not hesitate to demonstrate his disdain. The incident attracted the attention of other police officers, but instead of intervening, they stood by, watching their colleague behave. They were part of a system that either encouraged this behavior or was afraid to confront it. This silent approval only strengthened Reynolds' confidence in impunity. The entire scene, played out in front of onlookers, was a manifestation of how deeply racism had become embedded in the social and human rights systems. Reynolds's racially charged words were a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. Carla could see how, with each derogatory comment, her own dignity and self-respect were being targeted, and her inner anger was growing. Eventually, Reynolds ended his event by returning Carla's belongings, but his actions and words left a deep mark. Carla knew that every time she encountered such behavior, her resolve to fight and change the system only grew stronger. She understood that her fight for justice required not only effort, but also courage. As Reynolds returned to his car and continued his patrol, Carla stood on the sidewalk, processing the aftermath of what had happened. Her inner anger and determination mixed with her concern for those who had witnessed this humiliation. She knew her job was just beginning. Every instance of humiliation and cruelty she had experienced was part of her mission, and she was ready to continue to fight for those who could not stand up for themselves. The scene on the sidewalk left a mark on Carla's consciousness. She stood surrounded by the crowd, her legs sagging from shock, but her inner fire was stronger than ever. The humiliation that had ended this time was not just a personal insult. It was a manifestation of systemic racism that permeated every corner of society. As Reynolds walked away, leaving Carla standing among the scattered items and whispering onlookers, her gaze slid over the faces of the passers-by. They looked at her with sympathy, fear, or disgust, and Carla felt their attention like a cold stream. It was a sign that she was not the only one who had experienced this humiliation. she noticed a young woman in one of the front rows of observers. The woman, her black hair braided into pigtails, stood with a grim expression on her face, her eyes full of anger and despair. Their eyes met, and Carla saw her own emotions reflected in them. The young woman came closer and spoke to her, expressing her concerns. "It's just awful. We're constantly faced with this, and nothing changes." The words sounded like a cry of despair, and Carla felt her own emotions come flooding back. It was a reminder that racism wasn't just one person's problem. It was a systemic disease that permeated every aspect of life. Carla tried to calm down and collect herself so she could complete her mission. She understood that her work was important not only for herself, but for the entire community. Her task was to expose not only the actions of one person, but also the entire system that supported such behavior. She headed to the nearest police station, where the next phase of her work would begin. Once inside, she found the atmosphere as tense as it had been outside. The officers continued their work, sometimes whispering, sometimes laughing. Their demeanor was apparently calm and relaxed, despite what was happening outside the station. Carla began collecting documents and information, researching internal reports and complaints that might indicate systemic problems. She came across several records of previous complaints against Reynolds that had been closed or dismissed. These documents, collected in separate folders, showed a complete disregard for serious allegations. This was further evidence that the problem was not limited to isolated incidents, but was part of a larger problem. Her research was interrupted by one of the police officers, who, noticing her persistence, curiously asked what she was doing. Carla tried to maintain her cover and claimed that she was reviewing internal complaints documents related to several cases, which caught his attention. The officer was clearly not happy to see her and began asking questions that were clearly intended to distract her or make her job more difficult. The conversation was another example of the system protecting its own, even when it knows that those it protects are guilty of serious wrongdoing. Carla, feeling the pressure mounting, knew she had to tread carefully to avoid raising suspicion. Her goal was to gather as much evidence as possible that could prove systemic abuses and provide an opportunity for real change. Every document, every record, was important to building her case. That evening, when Carla had finished her research, she walked out of the station still shaken by what had happened. Every action, every word Reynolds had said, and the reactions of the other officers were part of a larger pattern of racism and bias that permeated not just one person, but an entire system. Her journey was just beginning, but she was determined to fight for justice and expose the system that allowed such racism to flourish. Carla knew her work would be difficult and challenging, but her inner fire and desire to change society were her greatest allies, and despite the challenges she faced, her resolve only grew stronger. Carla returned home late that night, her mind heavy with thoughts about what had happened. In her quiet apartment, she turned on the lamp and sat at her desk, spreading out the documents and notes she had collected. Each page was evidence of how deeply ingrained racism was in the system, but behind it all was her plan, a way she could use the data she had collected to uncover the truth. The next day, Carla returned to her investigation without wasting a minute. Her first step was to meet with several local activists and residents of the area to understand how systemic racism and abuse affected them. She knew that these stories were not only personal, but also part of a larger problem. Her goal was to gather additional evidence that could strengthen her case. She met with several residents who detailed their encounters with Reynolds and his colleagues. The testimonies were full of anger and pain, painting a picture of systemic oppression and racist behavior that was not limited to the police but permeated every aspect of life. Each story confirmed what Carla already knew: this was not an isolated problem, but part of a structure that needed to change. One such witness was Mia, a young woman who works for a local nonprofit. Her experience was particularly disturbing. She described how Reynolds had detained her brother on trumped-up charges and treated him harshly. When she tried to file a complaint, her application was ignored, and her threats of public exposure were met with intimidation. "It's not just random injustice," Mia said, her voice shaking with emotion. "It's a system. They protect each other and don't let us get justice." Carla remembered every word and carefully recorded the details. These testimonies were not just part of her investigation, they became a personal manifesto for her, confirming the importance of her work. Carla's next step was to prepare a full report of her findings. She knew that to make a difference, she needed to create not just documents, but evidence that could change public opinion and influence law enforcement. She began writing the report, gathering all the data, evidence, and observations she could gather. Her report described not only individual cases of abuse, but also broad patterns of systemic racism. Carla included transcripts, witness statements, and internal police documents that documented complaints being ignored and systemic abuses. Once the report was ready, Carla began looking for ways to publish it. She knew it would be difficult to break through layers of defense and bias, but her determination was unwavering. She contacted several independent news outlets and human rights organizations, providing them with all the information she had gathered. Finally, after weeks of hard work, her report was published. The article based on her investigation rocked the public. Headlines spoke of systemic racism and corruption in the police force, of the brutality and injustice that flourished under the protection of the system. The reaction was intense. Protests erupted across the city. People took to the streets demanding change and accountability. Loud voices demanded police reforms and stricter oversight of human rights bodies. Carla followed the events with a sense of deep satisfaction, but also with the understanding that this was only the beginning. The publication of her report brought attention to her case, but Carla knew that her work was not yet done. Every step forward, every protest, and every voice was a step toward a more just society. And although Carla still had a long way to go, her resolve to fight for truth and justice only grew stronger. She was ready to take on new challenges, knowing that her work mattered and that every step brought her closer to the goal she had set for herself. After the report was published, Carla watched as the public reaction escalated. Protests became a regular occurrence across the city. People took to the streets to voice their discontent and demand change. Rallies and demonstrations became frequent events, and Carla couldn't help but notice how the unrest was evolving into more organized movements seeking reform. At first, public attention focused on Reynolds, but it soon became clear that the problem was much deeper. As Carla followed the developments, she noticed that community groups and activists began to investigate other cases of racism and abuse. Expanding the scope of the investigation, city officials were forced to respond to the pressure, but the response was often superficial and ineffective, offering only cosmetic changes instead of real reform. Carla continued her work, now with the goal of bringing about genuine change. She contacted advocacy groups that provided her with resources and support. They worked to commission an independent investigation and make recommendations for police reform, but the process was slow, and Carla saw how difficult it was to break through bureaucratic hurdles and systemic resistance. While activists fought for justice, Reynolds remained in the spotlight. His behavior attracted attention in the local press, and questions about systemic bias were discussed on social media. But despite public pressure, Reynolds remained in office, showing how deeply rooted the problems were in the system. Carla realized that her work was becoming increasingly important, and that a deeper understanding of the problem was needed to make real change. She decided to conduct more research to understand how systemic racism affected different aspects of life. She met with victims of police violence, and discussed discrimination in education, healthcare, and the workplace. These meetings confirmed that racism was not just a police problem, but part of a larger social problem. One such meeting was with Erica, a mother of two, who described how her sons had repeatedly been victims of police brutality. One of her sons was stopped and detained on trumped-up charges while trying to return something he had forgotten in a store. Erica, like many others, had faced neglect from law enforcement. Her story was full of pain and frustration, and she expressed her hope that Carla and her colleagues could make a difference. Carla used these stories to create a larger report that covered not just police violence but racism in other areas of life. Her research included testimonies from people who had experienced discrimination and bias, and showed how these issues were interconnected. In parallel, Carla worked to create a platform for sharing experiences and supporting victims of racism. She organized a series of public meetings and forums where people could share their stories and discuss solutions. These events were an important step in building solidarity and awareness, allowing victims to feel that their voice matters. Despite her efforts, Carla faced constant resistance. Some government officials and public figures tried to discredit her work, accusing her of inciting conflict and disrupting order. These attacks were further evidence of how difficult it is to fight a system that protects its members from consequences. Carla also faced danger. Unknown people began to threaten her, leaving anonymous messages, and even tried to violate her privacy. These threats served as a reminder of how serious her fight was, and how important it was to take the step of exposing and fixing the system. Despite all the difficulties, Carla remained determined. Each new case, each new story was for her confirmation of the need to continue the fight. She knew that her work would not be finished until real change was achieved. Carla believed that the path to justice was long and difficult, but she was ready to go through it to the end. As she worked, she increasingly realized that her mission was not simply to expose racism, but to create social pressure that could lead to real reform and improvement in the lives of those who suffered injustice. And while many challenges still lay ahead, her determination and dedication were her best allies. Carla continued her fight, immersed in her work to expose the systemic racism that permeated public and human rights institutions. Every morning she began with new stress, constant threats, pressure from authorities, and a growing sense that her efforts were not yielding immediate results. With each passing day, she found it increasingly difficult to remain resilient as her personal experiences and emotions became more complex. At one point, Carla found herself with her financial resources dwindling. She could no longer pay for all of her research out of her own pocket, which created a host of problems. Her funding from advocacy groups and donors was insufficient to cover all of her needs, especially considering the high cost of legal services and security. It was another reminder of how difficult it is to be a Black woman in a society where resources are often unevenly distributed. Carla also noticed that her work was beginning to affect her personal relationships. Family and friends began to worry about her safety and mental state. One day, her mother, who had always been supportive, expressed her concern. "Carla, I understand that you want to change the world, but you have to think about yourself too. We are all afraid for you." These words were a hard reminder that her struggle was not just her own, but that it was impacting those who loved her. Carla felt her loved ones suffering with her, and this added an extra layer of stress and responsibility. Her work became not just a personal mission, but a burden she carried for all those who supported her. At the same time, her activities attracted the attention of not only her allies, but also her enemies. Local news articles began to appear accusing her of trying to stir up public unrest and undermine the police. These articles often contained biased and racist comments, portraying her as a threat to public order. These attacks, although expected, were painful and tiresome. But Carla's greatest challenge was the constant manifestations of racism in her everyday life. She encountered not only blatant cases of bias, but also more subtle and insidious forms. Meetings with officials and representatives of various organizations were often accompanied by hidden innuendos and indirect humiliations. She felt that her professional skills and achievements were often questioned simply because of her race and gender. At one of the public forums that Carla organized to discuss systemic racism, she encountered vivid displays of bias. One participant, clearly unhappy that Carla had raised questions about racism, said, "Why do you talk so much about racism? People just need to work harder to achieve their goals, instead of looking for excuses." The comment was a punch to the gut. Carla saw many in the room start to look at her doubtfully, as if she was guilty for raising uncomfortable questions. These moments showed how deeply ingrained racism was in people's minds, and how difficult it was to change societal attitudes and perceptions. Despite all this, Carla remained resilient. She found solace and support in her peers and colleagues. Together, they continued to fight for reform and improvement, creating new strategies and actions. Carla spent much of her time training and inspiring the younger generation of activists, helping them find their voice and fight for justice. Every effort she made, every step forward, was meaningful not only to her, but to all those who suffered from injustice. Her work became a symbol of hope and change for many, and this gave her the strength to continue despite all the difficulties. Carla knew that her fight would not end at one stage and that it would take more time and effort to achieve real change, but her determination was unwavering. She was ready to face any difficulties, knowing that her efforts could change the lives of many people and contribute to a more just society. Carla continued her work despite all the obstacles and difficulties. Each of her efforts became more significant, but the situation around her only worsened. The racism she faced became more overt and aggressive. One day, when Carla was leading a public meeting on racial injustice, the situation reached a critical point. Her meeting was attended by several radical groups who were clearly against her work and began to disrupt the order. They shouted racist slogans, carried offensive signs, and actively tried to disrupt the discussion. Carla and her colleagues were forced to cut the meeting short when physical safety was threatened. These radical groups did not limit their aggression to public forums. Threats against her began to appear on social media, becoming increasingly specific and dangerous. Several anonymous letters with threats arrived at her home address, and her car was damaged. These events were a difficult test, and Carla realized that she was dealing not only with a personal threat, but also with systemic aggression supported by radical groups. One of the most difficult moments came when Carla became the target of attacks from some local politicians. At a press conference, a local official accused her of inciting hatred and undermining public order. His words were not simply an attempt at self-defense, they reflected a systemic resistance to change and a deep misunderstanding of the problem. These accusations heightened her vulnerability, and Carla felt the public pressure growing even more overwhelming. Meanwhile, the situation at the police department was also deteriorating. Despite open investigations and public condemnation, Reynolds and his colleagues continued their work and their behavior did not change. Carla learned that the police had even begun to try to frame her by fabricating charges about her alleged illegal activities. These attempts to discredit her work were aimed at distracting attention from the real problems and causing her to leave. In this tense climate, Carla faced another challenge. Her colleagues and allies began to withdraw their public support. Under pressure from threats and intimidation from radical groups, many of them began to distance themselves from her in order to protect themselves and their organizations. This betrayal was especially painful for Carla, as she felt that her support and efforts were disappearing when she needed them most. Her personal life also became more strained. Relationships with loved ones began to crumble under the pressure of her work and threats. Friends and family who had previously supported her now increasingly expressed doubts and fears for her safety. These personal problems were exacerbated by constant work and emotional exhaustion. During this difficult period, Carla continued to look for new ways to fight. She began developing a plan to create educational programs and trainings to raise awareness about racism and to build alliances with other activists and organizations. Carla realized that the only way to combat systemic racism was to create a strong community of support and education. Carla also began collaborating with lawyers and human rights activists to create a legal foundation that could support her fight. They worked to gather evidence and prepare legal claims against the police and radical groups that were targeting her. Although her efforts became increasingly difficult and dangerous, Carla remained determined. She knew that her work was important and that every step forward was a step toward justice. Despite all the difficulties and threats, she continued to work to expose racism and create a society where justice and equality were realities, not just ideals. Carla also worked actively to create public campaigns that would bring attention to issues of racism and could create significant social change. These campaigns aimed to raise awareness of the issues of racism and hatred and to involve a wide range of people in the fight for justice. Every day brought new challenges, and Carla faced constant pressure, but her determination and inner fire remained strong. She knew that the real fight for justice was difficult and long, and that her efforts could change the lives of many. And although the path was strewn with obstacles and threats, Carla was willing to continue her work, knowing that every action she took was a step toward a more just world. Carla continued her intense investigation, immersed in constant pressure and threats. Every action to expose systemic racism was met with new difficulties, and her situation became more and more tragic. Recent events have brought her situation to a head. One evening, as Carla was returning home after a long day of work, she was stopped on the street by several aggressive men who hurled racial slurs at her and threatened her with physical violence. She managed to escape, but the incident left her with deep psychological scars and a feeling of constant threat. Carla was forced to take precautions, including increasing security at her home and constantly changing her travel routes. These measures created additional emotional and financial burdens. Fear and anxiety became her constant companions, and she found that her work, once a source of inspiration and strength, began to feel like a constant challenge. In addition, her financial problems continued to mount. Grants and donations that had previously helped support her work had dwindled due to increasing negative pressure and slander being spread against her. Carla began to struggle with debt, and her organization was on the verge of bankruptcy. Since her work could not survive without financial support, this created another obstacle in her fight. Internal conflicts within her team intensified. People who had previously been her support system began to openly express discontent and doubts. Carla often faced betrayal and subversion from those who were close to her. These internal conflicts led to constant arguments and made it difficult to organize effective work. Against this backdrop, her health began to deteriorate significantly. Carla suffered from chronic stress, insomnia, and physical illnesses associated with long-term stress. Doctors recommended urgent rest and treatment, but her work required her constant presence, and she could not afford a single day of rest. Her emotional and physical condition became critical, but she continued to work, refusing help and support. Carla's personal life was also in tatters. Constant threats and working beyond her means alienated her from her family and friends. Her relationships with loved ones became strained as they could not understand her constant presence on the brink of despair and her refusal to live a normal life. This isolation only worsened her depression and feelings of loneliness. Things escalated when her home was attacked one night. Unknown people threw stones through the windows, painted offensive messages on the walls, and left threatening notes. These actions were the culmination of constant threats, and Carla felt that her safety and life were under real threat. Soon after, Carla was forced to turn to security agencies and government agencies to ensure her safety. These measures became an additional financial burden, and even with the help of guards, Carla could not escape the feeling of constant vulnerability. Despair and fear became her constant companions. Her investigation also faced new challenges. The police and human rights bodies that were supposed to support her efforts began to turn against her. The reports she submitted were suppressed or ignored, and her calls for help often went unanswered. This only confirmed that the system was stacked against her and her work. Despite these challenges, Carla continued to seek new ways to fight. She reached out to international human rights organizations to raise awareness of her case and gain support beyond her country. These steps were her last hope to bring attention to the problem of systemic racism and bring about real change. Each day brought new trials and tribulations, and Carla felt her strength was being exhausted. She remained determined, but also realized that her work had become her personal cross to bear. While her efforts were aimed at exposing and correcting injustice, her own life and health were at risk, and she felt that her struggle could lead to even greater disappointment and tragedy. Carla continued to work despite everything she was going through, knowing that her fight was not only her own challenge, but also an attempt to make the world a fairer place for everyone who suffers from racism and bias. And although her path was littered with obstacles and tragedies, she could not give up on her mission, knowing that every step she took could lead to a change in the lives of others. Carla continued to struggle despite the increasing difficulties, and her situation became more and more tragic. Every day she felt her strength dwindling, and her life gradually turned into an endless series of trials. One night, Carla returned home after a long and exhausting day to devastating news. Her younger brother, James, had been arrested by the police for allegedly taking part in a street riot. He was accused of violent behavior and disobedience. Despite being a bystander, the incident was yet another example of police brutality, but for Carla it was personal. The situation with James was a major blow to Carla. She was forced to immerse herself in a legal battle to secure his release and a fair hearing. Her financial resources were depleting even faster, and she now had to pay for lawyers and court costs. This additional burden brought her to the brink of financial ruin, and she felt that her job was becoming increasingly unsustainable. James had been in custody for weeks, and every time she approached human rights groups and lawyers to speed up the process, it was met with increasing difficulty. While she tried to ensure his protection, her own safety continued to deteriorate. One day, her assistant discovered that her car had been set on fire. The vandalism was a shocking reminder of how dangerous her job had become. Despite everything that was happening, Carla decided to continue her activism, not only to fight for her brother, but also to continue her mission to expose racism. However, her physical and emotional state continued to deteriorate. She experienced panic attacks, insomnia, and depression. Doctors strongly recommended that she be hospitalized, but Carla refused, believing that her work was more important. When James was finally released, it was only a temporary relief to Carla. He had been deeply affected by his experiences in prison, and their family had suffered significant emotional and financial stress. The stress of her active struggle and the constant pressure had only worsened the difficult relationships between Carla and her loved ones. Carla tried to rebuild her health and life, but a new challenge soon came. Her organization faced even greater threats when a group of radical activists began attacking her events and public discussions. These attacks not only physically threatened her safety, but also led to further financial losses as sponsors began to distance themselves due to the growing risks. the situation in society also worsened. Police brutality continued to escalate, and the number of incidents involving racist crimes increased. Protests, which had once been a symbol of the fight for justice, began to be harshly suppressed. In response to protests, authorities began to use increasingly aggressive measures, including mass arrests and violence. Carla learned that her own name and reputation were being used in smear campaigns aimed at discrediting her work. Fake news and propaganda spread through the media, and social media portrayed her as an instigator of violence and a provocateur. These attacks only added to her emotional and psychological burden, creating more problems and dangers. One night, after another day of struggle and frustration, Carla returned home to find her apartment ransacked. Belongings were torn, documents were missing, and everything was turned upside down. This attack was the culmination of her fears and struggles, and she felt that her life was no longer safe. Her personal and work boundaries had been completely violated, and Carla knew that her efforts to fight racism and bias could have even more tragic consequences. As a result, her personal relationships and health continued to deteriorate. She began to experience a deep sense of isolation and helplessness, with emotions ranging from anger to complete despair. Despite her incredible efforts and desire to change the situation, reality increasingly became an insurmountable obstacle. Carla kept fighting, knowing that her work mattered and that she couldn't give up on her mission, but each day brought new challenges, and her story became more tragic, reflecting not only her personal struggles but also the deep systemic problems she faced. Despite the ongoing trials and tragic events, Carla remained resolute in her fight, even as her strength was waning. Many months later, in the midst of her personal and professional struggles, she was reminded of the event that had catalyzed her fight in the beginning of her journey, an incident with a white police officer who had humiliated her. The encounter took place at the police station where Carla was investigating. The officer, Reynolds, who had once publicly humiliated her, had re-entered her life, but now in a more sinister form. One day, Carla discovered that Reynolds was now a high-ranking officer in the department, and his actions had become even more aggressive and systemic. His influence on police decisions and internal politics was now obvious. Carla learned of this by chance when she was studying documents and reports on a new case of human rights violations. In one of these reports, she noticed a familiar name, Reynolds. His new actions and directives included the forced dispersal of protests, the use of violence against demonstrators, and constant reprisals against those who tried to expose police abuses. This was not just a coincidence, but a new reality that Carla had to face. Carla knew that Reynolds' return to her life was no mere coincidence. Her work exposing racism and corruption in the police force now came at the cost of a personal confrontation with him. Every time she encountered a new case of police violence or abuse, she saw his shadow, and it reminded her of that humiliating incident at the police station. In her public campaigns, Carla began to highlight how power brokers like Reynolds facilitated systemic racism and oppression. She collected evidence and testimony that confirmed his involvement in unjust practices and began documenting them to bring them to the public, but her efforts met with even more resistance. Reynolds and his supporters began a campaign to discredit Carla, using her old recordings and the materials she had collected to paint her in an unfavorable light. This campaign was not only aimed at destroying her reputation, but also at isolating and fearing her. They used everything from false accusations to aggressively pressuring her allies. One evening, as Carla was preparing for an important press conference where she planned to reveal new evidence, her office was raided. The attackers were apparently acting on instructions from those who wanted to stop her. Documents were destroyed, computers were hacked, and all the materials she had collected were stolen or damaged. The vandalism was so devastating that Carla was on the verge of total collapse. But even in this dark period, Carla did not give up. She continued to work despite the loss of part of her work and personal fears. Each new step was a step along a narrow and dangerous path, but Carla was driven by a sense of duty and the conviction that her work mattered. Noticing that her efforts to expose Reynolds and his actions had attracted the attention of major media outlets, Carla decided to use the platform to further highlight issues of racism and police brutality. She gave an emotional speech about how her personal experiences and struggles reflected larger issues in society. The speech was full of pain, but also determination, reflecting her indomitable will to continue the fight despite all obstacles. However, Her condition continued to deteriorate. The doctors again insisted on urgent treatment and rest, but Carla remained adamant. She felt that her mission in her fight for justice required her full attention and strength, despite her physical and emotional exhaustion. Gradually, her struggle became more personal and tragic. Each new obstacle, each attack, and each betrayal added a new dimension to her ordeal. Carla continued to bear this heavy cross, and her story became a symbol not only of her personal struggle, but also of the deep systemic problems she faced. And so, despite all the difficulties and tragedies, she continued to move forward, striving to change the world and make it more just, despite all the threats that haunted her at every step. Under constant pressure and increasing difficulties, Carla became increasingly involved in uncovering issues related to police brutality. The most striking symbol of her struggle was Police Officer Reynolds, who, unfortunately, increasingly influenced her life. Reynolds was one of the officers whose actions caught Carla's attention early in her investigation. His tough, aggressive approach to work and disregard for citizens' rights formed the basis of her initial investigation. However, while he was initially only part of a larger problem, his personal influence soon became more sinister and destructive. After Carla learned of his promotion and new influence, she began to scrutinize his career and actions. It turned out that Reynolds had used his new position to tighten his grip on the police force and implement tougher enforcement measures. His influence extended to all levels of the department, from planning operations to the actual use of violence. Carla collected a number of testimonies and documents confirming that Reynolds used his powers to implement aggressive policies. He organized raids during which he subjected citizens, especially those who tried to protest police brutality, to arbitrary detentions and violence. Many of those who came to Reynolds' attention reported inhumane treatment, torture and beatings. Her investigation led her to discover secret directives issued by Reynolds that instructed his men to use maximum force when suppressing protests and making arrests. These directives were laced with racial bias, which was clearly reflected in their implementation. They were used to justify violent actions against citizens who were ethnically and racially marginalized. Reynolds also implemented internal policies designed to protect his actions and discredit those who tried to expose them. He used department resources to create false reports and manipulate information to hide his abuses. Carla discovered that he had planted his supporters in key positions to ensure that any attempts to investigate and expose his actions were blocked at all levels. These discoveries became a serious challenge for Carla. Reynolds and his team began an active campaign against her. They used their influence to undermine her work by spreading slander and creating false accusations against her. Local media outlets began to publish headlines about Carla allegedly using her research for selfish purposes to destroy the reputations of respected police officers. Soon after, more attacks began on Carla. Her documents and the evidence she had collected were treated increasingly worse. Some were forged. Others disappeared entirely. Her phone was hacked and information from her correspondence was used to create false accusations. Carla became the target of threats and harassment, which only intensified when she tried to reveal the truth. Police raids and arbitrary detentions became part of her daily life. Reynolds and his supporters used every opportunity to intimidate her and her allies. One day, when Carla tried to organize a public action in support of human rights, the police broke up her rally without warning. Arrests were made and Carla was charged with disorderly conduct, a clear attempt to discredit her. Carla realized that her fight with Reynolds was becoming more and more dangerous and difficult. Her every move, every action was under close surveillance. Even her home address became known to Reynolds' supporters, which led to constant threats and attacks on her privacy. In this context, Carla faced the most difficult choice: to continue fighting despite the ever-increasing threats, or to try to find a way to protect herself and her loved ones. Her own safety and well-being were at risk, and she felt that her life was in constant danger. With each new attack, Carla became increasingly aware that her work to expose Reynolds and his system was no longer simply a fight for justice. It had become her personal war against a system that was stacked against her and her efforts. But even in her darkest moments, Carla continued to hold on to the hope that her efforts would lead to real change. Carla continued her investigation despite the increasing pressure and threats surrounding her work. The incident with Officer Reynolds and his actions against her became a central part of her fight. Soon after her work was attacked and slandered, Carla decided to expose the truth about Reynolds and his role in systemic racism and abuse. In parallel to her efforts to gather evidence, The situation with Reynolds also began to unfold. Carla and her team found evidence that Reynolds was actively using his position to suppress protests and conduct aggressive operations against citizens. Their revelations attracted the attention of the wider public and human rights organizations, which created additional pressure on the authorities. At one point, as a result of the efforts of Carla and her allies, an internal investigation was conducted into Reynolds' actions. The investigation uncovered numerous violations, including document forgery, inappropriate use of force, and abuse of authority. In response to these allegations, department officials ordered an internal investigation and suspended Reynolds. This decision was only the beginning of a long and complicated process. During the internal investigation, Reynolds found himself in the media spotlight. Carla and her lawyers provided compelling evidence that was published in the media and attracted public attention. This led to public protests and demonstrations in support of Carla and condemnation of Reynolds' actions. Many people voiced their demands for reform and accountability for police officers who abused their power. During the investigation, Reynolds faced numerous allegations from former colleagues and citizens who had been harmed by his actions. It turned out that many of his actions were part of a larger pattern of corruption and racism within the department. Questioning his integrity and professionalism, many of his subordinates began cooperating with the investigation, which only complicated his situation. What followed was a trial that was fraught with tension and public interest. Reynolds became the target of intense public and legal pressure. Evidence gathered by Carla and other sources demonstrated the extent of his abuses and illegal actions. The evidence showed that Reynolds was not only directly involved in the abuses, but also systematically attempted to cover up the cases and intimidate those who tried to expose his crimes. The trial was a real test of the justice system. During the process, Reynolds was accused of a number of serious crimes, including human rights violations, abuse of office, and falsification of official documents. Numerous charges were brought against him, covering a wide range of violations, from unlawful detention to the use of excessive force. The public attention to Reynolds' case attracted international human rights organizations and the media, adding to the pressure on the court and the government. Carla, despite her own exhaustion and hardship, remained actively involved in the trial, providing evidence and supporting efforts to ensure justice. Following his trial, Reynolds was found guilty on most charges. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term and barred from all law enforcement positions. The verdict was hailed as an important step toward justice, though for many it was only the beginning of a broader fight for reform and the eradication of systemic racism in policing. Reynolds went to prison, but even his incarceration did not solve all the problems associated with corruption and racism in the police force. Carla knew that her work was far from over. Her fight continued, and she continued to strive for reforms to prevent such cases in the future and create a fairer system. While Reynolds served his sentence, public opinion continued to evolve. It was clear to many that Reynolds' case had only freed the tip of the iceberg, and that systemic problems required deep-seated change. Carla remained resolute and determined to continue her work, knowing that her personal struggle had become symbolic of a larger fight for justice and equality. Following Reynolds' conviction, Carla continued her activism, focusing on the systemic changes needed to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. While Reynolds' conviction was a significant achievement, Carla knew it was only the first step toward deeper reform. Over the next year, Carla worked actively to create and support initiatives for police reform and systemic change. She collaborated with civil rights organizations, lawyers, and policymakers to advance legislation aimed at improving transparency and accountability in law enforcement. Her goal was to create a system that would not only prevent abuses, but also uphold civil rights. Carla has organized numerous public forums and conferences on issues of police brutality and racial injustice. These events have attracted a wide range of participants, from victims of police violence to activists and human rights scholars. The discussions at these forums have often been emotional and charged, as many participants have shared personal stories of violence and discrimination. One of Carla's most significant accomplishments was the creation of a fund to support victims of police violence. The fund provided financial assistance to victims, legal advice, and support in recovering from trauma. This initiative proved vital to many people who faced similar problems and helped them begin the journey to healing and justice. However, despite her successes, Carla continued to face serious challenges. Critics of her work continued unabated, and she had to endure constant attacks from those who were against reform. Some opponents used her own words and actions against her, trying to discredit her work and create doubts in the public. Political and financial interests associated with law enforcement also created obstacles to her initiatives. Meanwhile, signs of change were beginning to emerge in the community. Some police departments began implementing new policies and training aimed at reducing bias and improving community engagement. These changes, though small, were the result of public pressure and the efforts of activists like Carla. But reforms were slow, and Carla knew that fighting for change was a long process. While she worked on reforms, her own health continued to suffer. Long hours, constant stress, and emotional strain left her physically and mentally exhausted. Her doctors urged her to take time off to focus on her health, but Carla continued to refuse, believing that her work was of primary importance. Carla also continued to struggle with the aftermath of the attacks and threats she had endured. She moved to a safer place and increased her security, but fear and anxiety were constant companions. Her personal life remained in limbo, and she was on the verge of emotional burnout. During this time, public attention to issues of police violence and racism continued to grow. Global protests and human rights movements added pressure on authorities and drew attention to the problems Carla was trying to solve. Although her work remained difficult and demanding, she continued to believe in the need for change and the power of her mission. One day, Carla received an unexpected offer of cooperation from an international human rights organization. They offered to help her expand her work on a global level, which would open up new opportunities for her fight for justice. This offer was like a light at the end of the tunnel for her, a chance to use her efforts and achievements to change the system on an even broader level. Carla accepted the offer and began working to build an international coalition to combat police violence and racism. This new phase of her work gave her the opportunity to step into the international arena and contribute to the global human rights movement. Despite the challenges, she continued to fight for justice and change, knowing that her efforts mattered not only to her own community, but to the entire world. Her story of struggle and suffering inspired many people around the world. Carla continued to be a symbol of strength and determination, and her personal trials became part of a larger fight for equality and justice. On the day that Officer Reynolds humiliated Carla on the street, a scene was unfolding that could have become a symbol of both personal and public conflict. The sun was shining brightly and the city was filled with people enjoying the summer day. On one of the central streets, where various street events usually took place, ordinary life was going on. People were walking, chatting, shopping, and no one expected that this particular day would become the scene of an important event. Carla, a human rights activist, was on the street on business. She was discussing law enforcement with other activists and planning a small protest against police brutality. Suddenly, Reynolds interrupted her plans. Police Officer Reynolds, known for his aggressive and contemptuous attitude towards citizens, was on patrol in the area. He noticed Carla and her group, and his aggression flared up as soon as he saw them. Instead of reacting to their peaceful intentions, he decided to demonstrate his superiority and contempt. Reynolds, dressed in uniform, with buttons untidily fastened and a look of disdain on his face, approached Carla and her group. He began to speak to her in a rude and derogatory tone, ignoring her attempts to explain that their action was legal and aimed at raising awareness of legal issues. The incident attracted the attention of bystanders. People began to gather around to watch the conflict. Some of them stopped their daily activities to observe the situation, while others watched with caution, unsure of how to react. The atmosphere quickly became tense, as did the scene itself, as Carla and Reynolds began exchanging words. Reynolds began to raise his voice and his words became increasingly derogatory. He shouted at Carla, calling her a troublemaker, a disruptor of the peace, and a perpetual complainer. His words sounded like loud curses directed not only at Carla, but at anyone who tried to support her. He demonstratively grabbed her sleeve and tugged at her, creating scenes of violence that attracted even more attention from those around him. Some people in the crowd began to express their discontent. The first mutterings were heard that the police officer's actions were unacceptable. The first cries emerged from those who condemned the humiliation of Carla and demanded that Reynolds respect the rights of citizens. However, there were also those in the crowd who supported the police officer or were simply indifferent to what was happening. Against the backdrop of this conflict, other events began to unfold. Some of the bystanders began filming the events on their phones, capturing every moment of humiliation. These recordings began to spread online, which attracted even more public attention. The video quickly gained popularity on social media, and soon went viral, attracting the attention of not only local but also international media. By the time the situation reached its peak, the police squad was called in to investigate. However, instead of quickly intervening and stopping Reynolds' aggressive actions, the arriving colleagues only increased the tension, supporting their partner and ignoring the demands of Carla and her allies. In the midst of all this, many people began to rally in support of Carla. They protested Reynolds' actions and police brutality in general. Organized groups emerged to support her in her fight and to draw attention to the issues of racism and police brutality. These events marked a significant milestone in Carla's life. The incident led to her work in her fight for justice receiving even greater public recognition and support. Many began to recognize the scale of the problem and the need for systemic change. The conflict with Reynolds became a symbol of the broader fight for equality and human rights, opening up new opportunities for Carla and her team in their mission to overcome systemic racism and corruption. That day, the street where Carla and Reynolds ran into each other was bright and bustling. It was one of those places where the city was literally in full swing, and there was no sign that the everyday calm would be disturbed. People were walking along the sidewalks, some shopping, others just strolling, enjoying the warm day. Vendors had set up their stalls selling fruits and vegetables. Street performers were performing their routines, attracting the attention of passers-by. Everyone seemed to be absorbed in their own activities, until suddenly there was a noise. Carla, with a bright poster and inscriptions on her clothes, attracted attention to her action. She was confident in her rightness and was in a good mood, ready to explain her ideas and goals. But suddenly her calm was broken by Reynolds, who approached her with the obvious intention of disrupting her event. At first, Carla tried to talk to Reynolds calmly, explaining that her action was peaceful and legal. However, his aggressive behavior soon became apparent. He began yelling at Carla, using offensive and derogatory language, which attracted the attention of those around him. His abrupt movements and raised voice began to create a tense atmosphere. Many passers-by stopped to watch the scene, but the crowd's reaction was initially mixed. People watching the scene were divided into several groups. Some tried to ignore the conflict, pretending that nothing was happening and continuing with their own affairs. These people were perhaps preoccupied with their own concerns or simply preferred to avoid trouble, believing that interfering in the conflict would only make the situation worse. Others expressed their displeasure, but were hesitant to act. They whispered among themselves, condemning Reynolds' actions, but were afraid to come closer or to confront the police officer. Many of them were simply intimidated by the power and authority of the police. Some even, deep down, feared the consequences if they decided to intervene or support Carla. A select group of people began filming the incident on their phones. These were the ones who understood the importance of documentation and were keen to document human rights violations. They did so covertly, to avoid attracting the attention of Reynolds and his colleagues, who might try to confiscate their devices or destroy the footage. These videos soon became a key element in the public debate that ensued, and evidence of police misconduct. Unfortunately, there were those who supported Reynolds, either out of prejudice or fear. These people expressed their approval of his actions or directly pointed out that Carla was allegedly disruptive. This behavior only served to further isolate Carla and her group, creating a false sense that the community fully supported the officer's actions. Some people tried to intervene, but their efforts were quickly suppressed. Reynolds, feeling supported by his colleagues and the police officers monitoring the situation, used his authority to intimidate and alienate those who tried to offer assistance to Carla. His aggressive behavior and apparent superiority over the citizens created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. These events left Carla virtually alone, surrounded by people who chose to remain on the sidelines. This feeling of loneliness and helplessness was reinforced when she realized that her efforts to raise awareness of racism and police brutality were not receiving the support she needed. Meanwhile, news of the conflict began to spread around the city, and public opinion began to change. As soon as the videos were posted online, public outrage over Reynolds' behavior grew. Social media and news outlets became platforms for discussing police brutality and racism. Gradually, people began to unite, forming support groups and organizing protests. It is unclear how the situation would have turned out without public pressure and media attention. It was only a few days after the incident, when protests and public discontent reached their peak, that the authorities began to act more decisively. As a result, Reynolds was suspended from duty and his actions were subject to investigation. Carla, although still under pressure and facing many difficulties, felt that her efforts and fight for justice were beginning to bear fruit. A long road to change lay ahead, but she was no longer alone. Her story became a symbol of the fight for human rights and justice, opening the way for broader changes in the system and society. Following the Reynolds incident and subsequent protests, Carla found herself in the public eye. Her story brought attention to racism and police brutality, but there was a deeper issue that needed to be addressed. The events of the day Reynolds humiliated Carla showed how deep the roots of racism are in society. The street where the conflict took place was a busy place. People were walking, shopping and enjoying the warm day. Many, seeing what was happening, stopped to watch. It attracted many spectators, but the reaction was mixed. Many bystanders chose to ignore the conflict and carry on with their business, perhaps out of fear or a desire to avoid trouble. They may have felt that intervening in the situation could lead to conflict with the police or other problems. Some people condemned Reynolds' actions but were hesitant to speak out for fear of repercussions. Other bystanders, despite condemning what was happening, did not intervene because their fear of the police was too great. Reynolds, with his power and confidence in his impunity, continued his aggressive actions, which only increased the fear of those around him. This atmosphere of fear and uncertainty supported his behavior, allowing him to continue to humiliate Carla without any immediate consequences. Some people tried to help Carla, but their efforts were quickly suppressed. Reynolds and his colleagues who arrived on the scene supported him and increased the pressure on those who tried to intervene. Only a small number of people tried to record the incident on video to document the abuse. These recordings later became important evidence of police misconduct and attracted public attention. As time went on and the video spread online, public opinion began to change. People began to realize the scale of the problem and the need for change. Protests and rallies organized in support of Carla became the basis for discussions on issues of racism and bias. At the same time, Carla also began working to explain the causes of racism. Her events and lectures focused on the historical roots of racism, social and economic factors, and the influence of media and propaganda. Historically, racism is rooted in systems of colonization and slavery, where false theories of racial superiority were used to justify exploitation and oppression. Social and economic factors also played a major role. Black communities often face limited opportunities, which leads to a cycle of poverty and reinforces bias. Propaganda and media often portray black people in a negative light, which contributes to negative stereotypes. Personal upbringing and education also influence attitudes toward racial issues, as biases can be passed down from generation to generation. Carla used her influence to create educational programs and initiatives aimed at eliminating racism. She organized lectures and workshops to help people understand the causes of bias and the need to combat it. Her efforts brought attention to the need for reform in law enforcement and other institutions where bias can flourish without proper controls. As a result of her work, many people began to recognize the scale of the problem and the need for systemic change. Carla continued her fight, believing that understanding the roots of racism and working to eradicate it could lead to a more just society. Despite the difficulties, her efforts became a symbol of the fight for equality and human rights, opening up new possibilities for creating a just world. Following the Reynolds incident and subsequent protests, Carla not only gained a lot of public support, but also brought attention to important issues of racism and human rights. Despite the horrific ordeal she faced, her determination and resilience made her a symbol of the fight for justice. Over time, public and media pressure led to real change. Reynolds was fired and subjected to an internal investigation that revealed systemic problems in law enforcement. His actions became a shining example of how abuse of power and bias can ruin lives. Carla continued her work by organizing educational programs and public lectures. She actively collaborated with human rights organizations to create a platform for discussing and addressing issues of racism and bias. Her efforts led to the creation of new initiatives to train police officers and improve law enforcement interactions with the community. At the same time, her story inspired many people around the world. Protests supporting her initiatives led to discussions and the implementation of reforms aimed at combating systemic injustice. People began to speak openly about racism, and public discussions that had previously been ignored became more relevant and important. Despite her loss and hardship, Carla was able to transform her personal tragic experience into a powerful tool for change. Her determination to change societal perceptions and fighting spirit became a symbol of hope and change. Ultimately, Carla's story was a reminder of the importance of standing up for justice, even when it's difficult. It showed that individual action can make a significant difference in society, and that the fight for equality and human rights requires courage, tenacity, and collective effort. Carla's story, which began with humiliation and injustice, ended on a positive note, demonstrating the power of public pressure and personal determination. Her struggle led to an awareness of the importance of reform and improvement of the justice system. Reynolds was fired and his actions were the subject of public condemnation. The public attention to the incident helped to highlight systemic problems in law enforcement and helped initiate reforms. Carla continued her work, implementing educational programs and collaborating with human rights organizations. Carla's story exemplifies how individual efforts can shift public consciousness and lead to real change. Her resilience and determination made her a symbol of the fight for justice and equality. Through her experiences and actions, society began to recognize the importance of fighting racism and bias, and ultimately, her story inspired many to take action to create a more just world. Your opinion is very important to us, and we would like to know what you think about Carla's story. What emotions and thoughts does it evoke in you? Share your opinion in the comments below. It is really important for us to know how our stories affect you and what you think about the issues they raise. Also, if you like this story and want to see more of this kind of material, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell so you don't miss new videos. Your participation and support are very valuable to us. Have a nice day.